So we learned how to specify the location of a file. We learned how to write to a file and how to append to a file. The last thing we want to learn when it comes to files is how to read from a file. To read from a file, the first thing you want to do is to create a file object. File class is a class that is in the input-output package. And what you want to do is to create a file object that links to that file that you want to read. So this is done by using the file keyword, the file name of the class, my file, calling it my file, new file, and then link it to the name, which is customers.txt, for example, or whatever names that you want. Now, again, that name could be a full path to the file from a completely different folder. It could be something that is stored or prompted from the user. So I could have, for example, here string, file name is equal to, and some kind of a string here. It could be a prompt using scanner next line, whatever you want, just you can also link that here. All right, so that's how you create a file. Now, once you create a file, what you want to do is to link that file to a scanner object. All right, so you want to link that file to a scanner object, which is going to scan or read the file. All right, so if you remember, we defined scanners before, and we linked it to, if you remember here, scanner, and we linked it to system.n. So in this case, what we are trying to say is that scanner, you're going to scan the system.n, the standard input, which was the keyboard. Now we are telling scanner object, no, this time you're not going to scan the keyboard, you're going to scan a file, right? And this file is referenced to with the reference variable my file. All right. Now, the reason why we create the file here, or if you want to learn more about the file object, so here, for example, file object is very useful. It's going to give you several methods that can be very helpful. Even though we are not going to use them, but in this case here, you can see that creating a file object will make things easier. So one thing here is that, for example, it has a method that can read. So it gives you whether you have the permission to read the file or not, right? So if I go here and go and create file, this create file is a method that I just defined that is going to do this task for us. So instead of writing this every time, it's just going to create a file, open it, write 3 names, and then close it again. All right. Then what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to define a scanner. I'm going to prompt the user for a file name, and then I'm going to create a file object with this file name. All right. Now, if I stop here and just try to say system.out.println, for example, and then I'm going to say for the object file, I would like to say if to check if I can read this file. Compile. So I'm checking if I can read names.txt. Yes, you can. All right, something like this. Or other methods that can be very useful is get absolute path, for example. All right, so get absolute path. Then I can replace this here and compile names.txt, and you see it gives me the full path for this file, which is something that output could be dealt with or took as a string and go and pass it to another method or something that is going to do something with this file. So that is very, very helpful. All right, so having the file object is going to be a good thing for us. And then we take that file and then link it to that scanner, which tells that scanner input file, you are going to scan and read this file. Now, once you do this, that's it. You can use all the methods of a scanner to read the file contents, right? So if I have, for example, here names.txt, and I know that after creating this, I have these 3 names, Catherine, Chris, and Jean, with Catherine and Chris being in the first line, and then Jean in the second line. So I go and start reading strings. All right, so I'm going to say string sir input file dot next line. So I am reading the line from the input file and store it in string str and then try to print it here. So compile. I would like to read names dot text, and it reads the first line being Catherine Chris, all right, which matches what we know about this, like that it's the first line is being Catherine Chris. All right, so here names the text, and Catherine Chris is the first line. Perfect. Now, what about reading the second line? How can we do this, right? I would like to read Jean now. What you want to do is to go and create a new one, right? New string, and in this case, try to read. Now, string was defined before, so let's actually comment this whole thing and just make it as single demo with two string. So string stir input file next line, system.out print that, and then using string again, the stir again, to read the next line and then print that. Compile, and that is names dot text, and it reads the two lines. All right. Now, what happens if I try to read a third line? All right. So here, compile, and I try to go and read a third line. So from names.text, I would like to read 3 lines. Now notice here that it reads the first line, perfect, with the first next line. It reads the second one. I skipped. So it reads the first line, second line, and then I go and try to read the third line. That gives me a problem, no line found. All right, so no such element exception. So it doesn't find that line. So again, you open the file by creating the file object, you link it to a scanner, and then you go and read as many lines as you need and the file has, and then you close the file after you are done. All right, so this is how to read basic reading from a file. Now, that problem of having no line, we will find in the in a couple of demos, we are going to find a solution for this, how to avoid this problem and make sure that we are not trying to read a line that doesn't exist in a file. All right. Before we do this, let's look at how we can use that scanner object linked to the file to read the file contents. So I'm going to create a new text file here. All right, so let me new text document. I'm going to call it number or number the text. And in number the text, I'm going to store two numbers, 5 and 900. All right, and save it and close it. Now, what I'm going to do is to try to read that number.text. So here, string find name number text. I'm going to create a file object using this and then link that file to my scanner object to read it. Notice here that, of course, I'm importing input output package with the wildcard, and then I'm importing the scanner class from utility object from the utility package. Then what I'm doing next is that I'm reading the file contents, which is a number here, 5 and 900. I'm reading this as a next line. So that reading it using the next line method of the scanner object is going to read it as a string, and I'm storing this in a string, right? Of course, if I try to put that in end, it's going to create a problem. You're reading next line and trying to store it in end, that's not gonna work. So here I'm going to just keep it a string, and then I try to print this using stir plus 10 with whatever value I read from this file. So what do you think is going to be printed? Of course, if you have this as a string and you try to print line string plus 10, the whole thing is going to be converted to string, and then it's going to be concatenated, right? So here, if I run this one, I'm going to get, did it run? There we go. All right, so it's reading this as a next line, and stir plus 10 is going to concatenate, which is 5 plus 10 concatenated, that will give me 510, right? 5 plus 10. Now, on the other hand, I read the next line using next int method, stored it in num, then I add num plus 10 and try to print this. Now, num is an integer, integer plus 10 is going to be an integer operation or addition, and it's going to add 900 plus 10, which is going to give me 910 printed as an output. All right, so that just to tell you that whether the file contains strings or numbers, it depends on how you are reading it. If you're reading it as a string, it's going to be treated as a string. If you're reading it as a number, it's going to be treated as a number. So that is another thing about reading from files. The next thing is that question that I told you is how to avoid reading a line that doesn't exist. How to make sure that my code in a smart way is going to limit itself to the end of the file. All right. Now, to do this, there is a method that can help us, which is called HasNext. All right, with the scanner object, you can actually, before you attempt to read a line, you can actually make sure that there is a line. All right, so in this case, I would go and say, I have my scanner object. All right, I ask the user for a file name, and this is linked to system.m, by the way. And then I go and create my file name here, in which I'm storing that input. All right, then I create a file object, link it to a scanner, new scanner, and then I'm going to use this to read files. Now, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to set this in a while loop, and the condition is that while input file has next, keep reading. All right, so keep reading as long as input file has next. And if it has next is true, then in that case I have a string that I'm creating. I'm going to read the next line, and then I'm going to print that string. All right, so now I can go and run this one here and say names dot text. All right, and it reads the 2 lines and then it stops. All right, if I go to names.text and add a new name, Tem, Mark. All right, so here I'm adding 2 names, compile, run, and notice here that I'm not specifying. I'm not telling Java here that, oh, there are 2 lines, there are 3 lines, 4 lines. I'm not specifying anything. So here I can say names.text, and it's going to read all of them and then stop without giving errors. So that's how you can, for input file, the scanner object, you can actually check if it has next before you try to read next line. All right, so that can be very, very useful. Now, one last example that I'm going to give, which is actually a problem in the homework, is how to limit yourself to read 5 lines. All right, so here is the problem in this homework. It says, if I'm given a file, I would like to read the first 5 lines. All right, now you have to consider the possibility that the file has more than 5 lines. So in this case, you want to limit yourself to read the first 5 lines. Or there's also the possibility that the file actually doesn't have 5 lines, right? So in this case, you cannot insist that I'm going to read the first 5 lines because there is a 5th line or 4th line. So in this case, what you want to do is to limit yourself to reading the first 5 lines if you have more than 5 lines. Or if it's less than 5 lines, then you want to read whatever is there. All right, as long as it's within the limit of 5 lines. So that is a condition that can be a little bit tricky, and you have to think about it. And one thing before actually we go there, when I ask you to read the first 5 lines, people for some reason just assume that I'm giving you a file that has more than 5 lines and I want you to read the first 5 lines. As a programmer, you have to think about the possibility of what if, right? A lot of what if questions. What if the file doesn't really have the 5 lines? This is something you need to think about. So so that's what we are going to do. I'm going to create a file that has 5, 1, 2, 3, 6 names. All right, 6 strings, and then I'm going to read that file. So here, after creating the file, I'm going to, instead of prompting, I could just go and link that to whatever, just to keep things simple. So I'm going to remove this here. I'm just going to say names.text as a string. Oops. All right, there we go. Names.text, compile. All right, and then create the file, and then I go and try to read it. Now, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to create a counter for the number of lines that I read, and then I'm going to say, as long as I am less than 5 and there is a next line, keep reading. All right, so this is how to build that condition. That was the challenging part for this homework problem. So what is going to happen is that it's going to read the first 5 lines: Catherine, Java, Jean, Boone, and NC. All right, so that is something that you can consider. Now the problem is, what if I comment this and people just someone limits the condition to be just 5? All right, now that is going to give you the error, right? No line found. File has 3, you're trying to read 5. All right, and now if I just put the other part of the equation here, of the condition, input file has next, it would read the whole thing, not just the first 5. All right, so what you want to do is to put that compound condition here that is going to either read up to 5 lines, or it's going to check if it has next and continue to read. So I think that's it for how to read files. One last thing that I want to point out, notice here that all of these slides are just talking about these demos that I just showed you. Detecting the end of the file, reading limit number, like 5 lines of the file, and so on. Now, one thing to notice here is that even though we are not dealing with print writer or file writers in the reading, we are still throwing input-output exception, which we didn't do before when we dealt with scanners. And again, that is because a scanner could have face a problem dealing with this file, and that's why it's an input-output problem. And you still need to throw the exception of input-output exception. So that is something there. And notice here that again, I said every method deals with files, input-output, it has to throw that exception, right? If you are not going to handle it or deal with it. And that's why even when I created that local method, right, private, it's an inner method here, method that is inside that class. I'm creating that method to create a file, and it's going to deal with files, and that's why even this method has to throw the input-output exception. All right, so this is something to keep in mind. A method dealing with input-output, if it's not going to handle the input-output exception, it needs to throw it.